For decades, American strategy in Europe depended on one unshakable assumption: Britain would always be there, ready to fight alongside America against any threat. But when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, something unprecedented happened. Poland, not Britain, led Europe's military response. The Baltic states provided more weapons per capita than Britain could afford. Nordic countries opened their borders to millions of refugees, while Britain struggled to process thousands of visa applications. The country that once ruled a quarter of the world's surface was being outperformed by nations it had helped liberate just decades earlier. Britain's army is now smaller than it's been since the Napoleonic Wars, and the defense budget barely meets NATO's minimum requirements. America's most reliable ally for over a century has now become one of its weakest. And why? Was it Britain's slow economic decline, America's growing reliance on more capable partners, or a combination of the two? This is the story of how Britain lost America. The phone call came at 3 a.m. London time on October 30th, 1956. British Prime Minister Anthony Eden was awoken with urgent news. President Eisenhower was on the line and he was furious. Britain and France had just launched a secret invasion of Egypt to retake the Suez Canal for Eden. This was about maintaining Britain's position as a global power. The Suez Canal was Britain's lifeline to its empire. Lose control of it and Britain would become just another European country. But Eisenhower saw it differently. Without consulting America, Britain had launched a war that could drag the entire Western alliance into conflict with the Soviet Union. His response was swift and devastating. Sell American holdings of British debt immediately, crash the pound, force Britain to choose between financial collapse and military withdrawal. Within 72 hours, Britain's currency was in free fall. The government was hemorrhaging money. Eden faced a choice that would define the next 70 years of British-American relations: defy America and watch Britain's economic collapse, or submit and accept that the junior partner in the alliance was no longer America. He chose submission. British forces withdrew in humiliation. Eden resigned in disgrace. The message was clear to everyone watching. Britain could no longer act independently on the global stage without American permission. But here's what most people don't realize about Suez. It wasn't just a diplomatic crisis. It was the moment America discovered that Britain was already economically dependent on American support. The war had left Britain so deeply in debt that a single American threat could bring down the government. The British Empire that had once been America's equal partner was revealed to be a hollow shell, maintained by American goodwill and financial support. What looked like a sudden crisis was actually the exposure of a decline that had been building for years. The question that would haunt British leaders for the next 7 decades was simple. If Britain couldn't act independently, what value did they offer America as an ally? The answer to that question would determine whether the special relationship would survive Britain's transformation from global power to regional player. And as we'll see, Britain chose the wrong answer. By the 1960s, British leaders faced an impossible equation: maintain global commitments with a shrinking economy, or accept that Britain was no longer a world power. They chose denial. The East of Suez policy kept 50,000 British troops deployed from Singapore to the Persian Gulf, protecting trade routes and former colonies that Britain could no longer afford to defend. The Royal Navy maintained bases in Hong Kong, Malta, and Gibraltar. The RAF operated from Cyprus to the Indian Ocean. But the economics were brutal. Britain was spending 7% of its GDP on defense, more than the Soviet Union, while its economy grew slower than any other major Western power. Every pound spent on overseas bases was a pound not invested in the industrial modernization that might have reversed Britain's decline. The breaking point came in 1976. Facing another currency crisis, Prime Minister Harold Wilson was forced to choose between defending the pound and defending the empire. He chose the pound. In a single announcement, Britain withdrew from all military commitment east of Suez overnight. The Royal Navy abandoned bases it had held for over a century. American officials watched in alarm as their most reliable ally retreated from regions where Soviet influence was expanding. But there was nothing they could do. Britain simply couldn't afford to stay. The 1970s brought new humiliations. Inflation reached 25% as industrial strikes paralyzed the economy. The government imposed a 3-day working week to conserve electricity. By 1976, Britain was forced to seek a bailout from the International Monetary Fund, a devastating blow to national pride for a country that had helped create the post-war financial system. Margaret Thatcher's election in 1979 promised renewal, but her solution came at a strategic cost. To control inflation and restore competitiveness, she allowed market forces to destroy Britain's industrial base. Manufacturing employment fell from 7 million to 3 million during the 1980s. The coal mines that had powered British industry were closed. The shipyards that had built the Royal Navy were shuttered. Financial services grew to replace manufacturing, transforming London into a global financial center. But this made Britain more dependent on international capital flows and less capable of independent military action. You can't build tanks or ships with banking services. The end of the Cold War should have been Britain's opportunity to redefine its role. Instead, it exposed how much British influence had depended on serving as America's European partner against the Soviet Union. With that threat gone, America had less need for British support and more options for European partnerships. Throughout the 1990s, Britain tried to maintain relevance through military interventions alongside America. The Gulf War, Bosnia, Kosovo, Britain was always ready to support American operations, but these deployments revealed growing capability gaps. British forces increasingly depended on American logistics, intelligence, and air support for basic operations. Tony Blair's decision to support the Iraq War in 2003 was driven partly by desperation to maintain the special relationship at a time when Britain's strategic value was declining. But even this loyalty comes at a cost. Britain could only deploy 45,000 troops to Iraq compared to America's 150,000, and they struggled to sustain even that modest commitment. The 2008 financial crisis delivered the final blow to British pretensions of global power. The economy contracted more severely than most other developed countries. Defense spending was slashed in successive budget reviews that eliminated capabilities built over decades. By 2010, Britain's army was smaller than it had been since the 1850s. The Royal Navy could barely maintain 2 aircraft carriers operating simultaneously. The RAF lacked sufficient aircraft for sustained operations. Each budget cut made Britain less valuable as an ally and more dependent on American protection. The pattern was clear. The economic decline led to military weakness, which reduced strategic value, which made Britain more dependent on America while offering less in return. It was a downward spiral that accelerated with each passing crisis. There were 3 pillars of decline. Number 1, the industrial hollowing. Walk through the former industrial heartlands of northern England today and you'll see the graveyards of British power. The coal mines of Yorkshire are flooded ruins. The steel mills of Sheffield are shopping centres. The shipyards of Newcastle build offshore wind turbines instead of warships. This deindustrialization wasn't just economic change, it was strategic suicide. Manufacturing capability determines a nation's ability to sustain military operations, produce advanced weapons, and maintain technological independence. When Britain dismantled its industrial base, it also eliminated the foundation of military power. The numbers tell the story. Manufacturing fell from 30% of GDP in 1970 to just 9% today. Britain now produces fewer cars than it did in the 1970s, despite having a larger population. The country that invented the steam engine imports most of its steel. Compare this to America's other key allies. Germany maintained its manufacturing base and now produces advanced military equipment that America wants to buy. Leopard tanks, submarine technology, precision machinery. Japan's industrial capacity makes it indispensable for containing China. Even Poland is rapidly building defense manufacturing capabilities. Britain, meanwhile, struggles to produce basic military supplies. When the Ukraine war started, Britain quickly exhausted its stockpiles of artillery shells and had to beg other NATO allies for ammunition. The country that once armed half the world now depends on foreign manufacturers for its own defense needs. The 2 new aircraft carriers exemplify this dependence. Despite costing £6.2 billion, they required American engines, Italian radar systems, and international partnerships because Britain lacked the industrial capacity to build them independently. They're symbols of British ambition built with foreign technology. Number 2. Brexit Isolation. June 23, 2016, Britain had just voted to eliminate its primary strategic value to the United States, serving as America's bridge to European decision-making. For decades, Britain's most important contribution to the alliance wasn't military capability, but diplomatic access. When America needed to coordinate European policy on Russia, China, or trade, they worked through London. British officials sat in EU meetings, shaped European positions, and ensured American interests were considered. Brexit eliminated that advantage overnight. Britain could no longer offer America access to European decision-making because they were no longer part of European decision-making. When America needs to coordinate with European allies today, they call Berlin, Paris, or Brussels directly. The economic costs have been devastating. Trade between Britain and the EU has fallen 25% since Brexit. Foreign investment has plummeted as multinational corporations relocate European operations to remain within the single market. Major financial firms have moved thousands of jobs from London to Frankfurt, Amsterdam, and Paris. Brexit has cost Britain an estimated 4% of its GDP annually, roughly $140 billion that could have funded military modernization or foreign aid programs. Instead, it's been lost to reduced trade and bureaucratic friction. The political isolation is equally damaging. Britain no longer participates in EU foreign policy coordination. They can't shape European sanctions policy or defense initiatives. When the EU announced its Strategic Compass defense plan, Britain was excluded from discussions that will determine European security for the next decade. Brexit also triggered internal divisions that make Britain an unreliable long-term partner. Scotland voted against Brexit and continues pushing for independence. Northern Ireland remains a source of ongoing tension with the EU. These fractures make it difficult for America to plan long-term strategies around British participation. Number 3. Defense spending. The most visible symbol of British decline sits in Portsmouth Harbour. HMS Prince of Wales, one of Britain's 2 new aircraft carriers, broken down and unable to deploy. The ship that was supposed to demonstrate British naval power instead became a metaphor for a military that looks impressive on paper but lacks the resources to function effectively. Britain now spends just 2.3% of its GDP on defence, barely meeting NATO's minimum requirements. Compare that to Poland's 4%, Estonia at 3.4%, or Greece at 3.8%. Countries that Britain once considered minor allies now outspend them on defence as a percentage of national wealth. The absolute numbers are even more telling. Britain's $68 billion defense budget sounds substantial until you realize it's smaller than what individual American states spend on education. Poland, with half of Britain's population, plans to spend $35 billion annually on defense by 2030, more than half of Britain's total budget. This budget constraint forces impossible choices. Britain can maintain nuclear weapons or adequate conventional forces, but not both. They can project power globally or defend the homeland effectively, but not simultaneously. Every capability they preserve means another they must sacrifice. The result is a military that appears capable but lacks depth. Britain can deploy a brigade for 6 months or a division for 6 weeks, but not both. They can contribute to American-led operations but cannot lead major operations independently. Their forces are increasingly dependent on American logistics, intelligence, and air support for basic functions. The evidence of Britain's declining value isn't found in statistics, it's visible in American behavior. When America faces its greatest strategic challenges, they increasingly turn to other allies first. The AUKUS submarine deal perfectly illustrates this shift. Announced in September 2021, the partnership between America, Britain, and Australia was supposed to demonstrate the enduring value of the special relationship, but look closer and you'll see a different story. Australia is providing the geography, bases in the Indo-Pacific that are crucial for containing China. America is providing the technology, nuclear propulsion systems and advanced weapons. Britain is providing what exactly? Submarine expertise they're struggling to maintain for their own fleet. The real purpose of AUKUS isn't to strengthen Britain, it's to manage Britain's decline while building a more capable partnership with Australia. British officials celebrate their inclusion, but they're increasingly the junior partner in their own alliance. When China imposed its security law on Hong Kong in 2020, Britain's response revealed the limits of their influence. They offered visa pathways to Hong Kong residents and imposed limited sanctions, but they couldn't provide meaningful economic alternatives to Chinese pressure. Compare that to Australia, which accepted massive economic costs to maintain strategic independence from China or Japan, which is building military capabilities specifically designed to counter Chinese expansion. The Ukraine war has been even more revealing. When Russia invaded in February 2022, the initial Western response was led not by Britain, but by Poland, the Baltic states, and Nordic countries. These nations provided military aid worth higher percentages of their GDP than Britain could afford. Poland alone has committed over $3 billion in military aid to Ukraine, nearly 1% of their GDP. Britain's total commitment is larger in absolute terms, but represents a much smaller sacrifice relative to their economy. More importantly, Poland has become the logistics hub for Western military aid, the primary training ground for Ukrainian forces, and the leading voice for aggressive action against Russia. American officials now speak privately about Tier 1 allies who can contribute meaningfully to major operations, and Tier 2 allies who provide political support but limited capabilities. Britain is increasingly seen as Tier 2, despite the historical relationship. The shift is visible in American diplomatic priorities. When President Biden needed to coordinate the Western response to Russian aggression, his first calls went to Poland, Germany, and France, not Britain. When America announced new military deployments to Europe, the largest increases went to Poland and the Baltic states. Britain remains important for intelligence sharing through the Five Eyes partnership and provides valuable diplomatic support for American initiatives, but they're no longer indispensable for America's most critical strategic objectives. Other allies offer better geographic positions, stronger economies, or more capable militaries. The special relationship hasn't ended, it's just become less special as other relationships have become more valuable. But Britain's problems run deeper than economic decline or military weakness. The United Kingdom itself is falling apart, and this internal fragmentation makes Britain an increasingly unreliable partner for long-term American strategic planning. Scotland's independence movement poses the most direct threat to the alliance. If Scotland leaves the United Kingdom, it would take with it the Faslane naval base where Britain's nuclear submarines are stationed. There's no alternative location in England or Wales that could accommodate the nuclear deterrent. The geography simply doesn't exist. Scottish independence would also eliminate Britain's claim to be a medium-sized power. England alone would have just 56 million people and a significantly smaller economy. The United Kingdom that America has partnered with for over a century would cease to exist, replaced by a smaller, weaker England with uncertain political stability. Opinion polls consistently show Scottish support for independence hovering around 45 to 50%. Brexit, which Scotland opposed by 62% to 38%, has strengthened the independence movement by demonstrating how Scottish preferences can be overruled by English voters. The next major economic or political crisis could push support over the threshold. Northern Ireland presents a different but equally serious challenge. Brexit has reignited tensions that America helped resolve through the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. The Northern Ireland Protocol creates ongoing disputes between Britain and the EU that distract from broader alliance priorities and consume political bandwidth that could be devoted to international cooperation. American politicians with Irish-American constituencies are increasingly critical of British policy in Northern Ireland. This domestic political pressure limits America's willingness to support Britain in other issues where their interests might diverge. The alliance that once helped America navigate complex international challenges now creates additional complications in American domestic politics. Britain has also experienced unprecedented political instability since the Brexit referendum. 5 different prime ministers have occupied Downing Street since 2016, creating policy inconsistency that frustrates American officials trying to coordinate long-term strategies. The 2022 economic crisis under Liz Truss's government demonstrated how quickly Britain can become a source of global instability rather than strength. When the pound crashed and government borrowing costs spiked in September 2022, it created ripple effects across international markets that required intervention from the Bank of England and IMF warnings about global financial stability. America found itself managing the fallout from British domestic policy failures rather than coordinating with Britain to address shared challenges. For American strategic planners, this political chaos makes Britain an unreliable partner for multi-year commitments. How do you build long-term alliance relationships with a country that might not exist in its current form within a decade, led by governments that change every few months? The internal fractures also drain resources that could contribute to alliance objectives. Police and military assets deployed to manage tensions in Northern Ireland aren't available for international operations. Political energy consumed by Scottish independence debates can't be devoted to foreign policy coordination. Economic resources spent on managing internal divisions can't fund defense modernization or international aid. Britain's value as an ally has always depended on political stability, economic strength, and national unity. All 3 foundations are now crumbling simultaneously, making Britain less reliable precisely when America needs dependable partners to address challenges from China, Russia, and other threats. The transformation is complete. The country that once needed no allies because it ruled the seas now needs allies because it can barely patrol its own waters. Britain's journey from global superpower to regional player represents one of the most significant geopolitical shifts of the modern era. The question isn't whether this decline can quickly be reversed. It's whether the Western alliance can adapt to a world where America's oldest ally has become one of its weakest. But that's just our opinion. What do you think? Let us know in the comments and be sure to subscribe for more of today's economic stories.